Let's start by doing an introduction to cloud computing. Before cloud computing, if we actually look 10 to 15 years back, in each company's data centers, we had a ton of servers, and each server had a different purpose, maybe running on a different hardware and even with different operating systems. Each new application that you installed, the vendor required that their application ran on a dedicated server. Each one of those servers had their own CPU, RAM, and hard drive resources, of course, and each one of them needed enough resources for utilization at peak time. But what this did is that on average, most servers were really underutilized, and organizations were spending a ton of money on hardware that most of the time was not even used at 10% of its capability. We then started to implement virtualization, which allowed us to run multiple virtual machines on a virtual host, so we were able to get more usage out of our hardware and cut down space, cooling, and of course costs. However, even with virtualization, we still had a few disadvantages such as high upfront costs, since we needed to buy really powerful virtual hosts, and then we needed to keep them for 5 years so they paid themselves off. We then still needed to pay for space in the data center, as well as electricity and utility costs for cooling and other server needs. Furthermore, hardware maintenance was still needed and is still needed in virtualization environments, as this can break down, network cards can go bad, and so on. Virtualization is really a lot better than dedicated hardware, so don't get me wrong, but there is still space for improvement, and this is where cloud computing comes in. Cloud computing enables companies to consume a compute resource, such as a virtual machine, storage, or an application, as a utility just like electricity, rather than having to build and maintain computing infrastructures in-house. In a cloud environment, you have the cloud provider, which owns the data center and manages all of the hardware like servers, networking, and of course, virtualization. As the cloud is fully built on the principle of virtualization, no client has ever direct access to the hardware, simply to a virtualized environment. All of those resources are pulled together and then shared to multiple clients that all consume the same hardware. Those clients do not need to know on what servers they run, or how many servers their different environments are running on. They simply consume a service, and the cloud provider is the one making sure there are enough shared resources to handle everything. In a cloud environment, users simply select what services they want to use, with each service having a price per user or per minute of utilization of that specific resource. This way, organizations can be more dynamic and cost-effective and reduce upfront cost. Since the money you pay for cloud does not get deprecated over multiple years, it's really a resource you use right away. The cloud cost usually goes into the operating expenses, or OpEx, instead of the capital expenditures or CapEx. So this really allows you to deduct costs in the current year without needing to deprecate the hardware cost over multiple years. And this depending on how your accounting is set up, and I don't want to get really into accounting details in this course, but this can have a really big tax advantage for your company. Here's an example of billing or cost for the cloud. Here we're calculating the cost of a virtual machine inside Microsoft Azure. First of all, I need to select the specifications of the virtual machine that I want. In this case, I'm selecting a virtual machine with 2 cores and 8 GB of RAM. You can see right away the cost would be about 15 cents an hour. I can also select the operating system, in this case Windows. And because Microsoft owns Windows, the cost that I pay for this virtual machine also includes the cost for the Windows operating system it'll be using, so I'm getting that license as a service as well. For the estimate, I can also choose how many hours I expect this virtual machine to be used per month. So if I use this VM for 730 hours, my cost would be $110 per month. And as you can see, in Azure, virtual machines are billed per second, so it's really, really flexible. Most cloud providers will also offer you savings if you prepay for a number of years. So let's say I noted I will need this VM for 3 years, I could save up to 55% of my computing costs, which would make sense if some servers are always up. Cloud services can also be scaled depending on demand and even automatically. In this screenshot, I have an app service plan in Azure, which is a platform in which you could host websites. I could enable auto-scale on it. This way, I can see, for example, when the CPU usage goes above 70%, add more CPUs or instances to that service. This can be really useful for public websites or different apps, so you can pay a set amount at rest or when they're not used a lot. But if you have a peak where lots of people are connecting at the same time, it will increase the resource only for that set amount of time. Something else that is a big advantage of the cloud is reliability. In a cloud scenario, the cloud provider takes care of the high availability and disaster recovery plans of their platform. Just to go over those terms so you see what the difference between those two is, high availability is usually to protect us against software and hardware failures. Those are usually very local, like a rack goes down, a server loses power, a service crashes, or something like that. On the other side, disaster recovery is something much bigger, like a natural or human-induced disaster, for example, a flood, fire, an earthquake that puts the whole data center down. The cost to implement the high availability in-house can grow really, really quickly because you might need a second data center on the other side of the country for which you need to pay for servers, networking, utilities, and so on. So from a cost perspective, the cloud can offer a much better solution for a better cost.